message. Thank you. So we will be recording this session and put it on YouTube, but we won't be recording the Q&A. So I hope that's okay for everyone, but by staying here, you give your consent for being recorded. Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce this interdisciplinary lecture by Bervoets, Beljaars and Hanne on letting Tourette's be. Before we start, I will give some background to these lecture series and to why we've decided to do these lectures and to the project from which they originate. So letting Tourette's be is part of a series of lectures that we have called the Neuroepigenetics Interdisciplinary Lectures. Neuroepigenetics is an ERC-sponsored project of which I'm the PI, and Jo is a PhD student. So I'm very pleased that one of the speakers is presenting now research that has been done in the context of the project. And in the, let me check. Yeah, in the start of the Corona crisis, we decided that well, our project has started in the beginning of 2019, and the first year we invited a lot of interesting people. For example, Hanne, who is presenting now, and Diana. They were we spoke to them in the first year of the project. But then, of course, there was the Corona crisis, and we wanted to also continue discussing interesting issues with interesting people, and we decided to launch a lecture series, which would also be recorded and put on YouTube for other people who cannot join to view afterwards. Now, before I say something more about the lectures that have already been done, maybe for some of you who are new, I would like to say something about the project itself, Neuroepigenetics. I've put here a screenshot of the website of our project. It's a bit mouthful to explain what the project is about. It's actually what we're trying to do is investigating how new concepts of biology, more dynamic of concepts of biology, may influence how we think about the ethics of neurodevelopmental, so-called neurodevelopmental conditions, specifically autism, ADHD, and Tourette's. We have been doing quite a lot of research on autism and Tourette's, thinking about Tourette's, what is Tourette's and how can we think about Tourette's differently is one part of the project, which is executed by Jo. So we are actually doing a lot of things with a lot of methods. We are doing theoretical reflection on what does actually responsibility mean in the context of epigenetic and environmental influences. But we also think about the impact of certain dichotomies like nature, nurture, like gene, environment, etc., etc. We think about concepts of collective responsibility. And we also think about specific methods that we could use to investigate these issues, and specifically to give experience stories of people with certain diagnoses a central role in the way we do research. And we've been doing some classic qualitative research, also some qualitative research with arts-based methods. That's our postdoctoral researcher, Leni, is doing that. But we also have been doing some more quantitative research from using methods from experimental philosophy. Now, we have already, I haven't counted yet what the number is of this actual lecture, but we can do it now. I think it is the 7th or the 8th lecture that we have been doing in the context of this interdisciplinary lectures. The first one was in August 2020, was by Eva Jablonka, who talked about cultural epigenetics. We also had some lectures on autism. For example, in September 2020, this was together with working group on autism ethics, philosophical perspectives on neurodiversity with Jana van Grunsven, Robert Chapman, and Jo Bervoets. We had a lecture of Rachel Rosen and Judith Souza on To Whom Does the Future Belong, some responsibilities towards future generations. We had a lecture about Anna Stenning, who thinks about narratives and what they can teach us about autistic time. We had a lecture from August Gorman, who talked about ideal agency and against ideal agency. In September, we had a really nice conference on responsibility, psychopathology, and stigma, where we had some headlines by Victoria McGeer, Hannah Pickard, Nick Heslam, and Maureen C. And our last lecture before this one was by Valeria Bizzarri on the link between diagnosis of collective emotions. And she also talked about the history of Asperger's syndrome. And for today, I'm very happy to introduce Jo Bervoets from the University of Antwerp, Diana Beljaars from the Swansea University, and Hanne de Jaegher from the University of the Basque Country on the topic of Tourette's and on letting Tourette's be. So what will be the program today? I'm just doing my introduction. I'm almost finished, no worries. The interesting stuff starts in exactly 1 minute. And then we have the lecture till 4:45. And after that, we have some responsives. The first response is by Kristien Conelea from the University of Minnesota. And then there is a response by Daniel Jones, who's a researcher at Newcastle University. And normally we would also have a response from Jean Steyaert, who is a Belgian child psychiatrist. He's the expert on Tourette's in Belgium, but he's had an accident, so he couldn't join. He's still recovering, and I will do a small response. But I think it's more important that you hear from Kristien Conelea and Daniel Johnson. So my response will be very short, and the other respondents will have more time. And after that, there is half an hour from Q&A with the public, with the people who are here as participants. So Jo already sent you the housekeeping rules. So it will be recorded. It's already being recorded, but we will stop the recording at the time the general Q&A begins. So don't worry to ask questions. They will not end up on YouTube. And so we will do a general Q&A after the respondents. And please stay muted and don't put anything any questions in the chat before that. But of course, if there are any remarks like problems with the connection, etc., that we can do something about, you're still allowed to notify us. And during the Q&A, of course, unmute when given the floor, and you can also share your video, so it's nice to see who's there. But of course, if you're uncomfortable in sharing your video, that's also perfectly fine. Also, if you don't want to speak, but you would rather write a question in the chat during the last 30 minutes, that's also perfectly fine. Okay, now I give the floor to Diana, Hanne, and Jo, and I will stop sharing my screen, and Jo can share his screen.
Thanks so much, Kristien. That was fantastic. Thanks for the introduction. And you're taking off quite a lot of what I wanted to say as well, so that's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Your interest means the world to us, and we're incredibly proud to put this panel together with Kristien and Daniel and Belgian Kristien as well, instead of Jean. So what we'll be doing is present a paper that we've been working on together between Hanne and Jo and I, and which came from a kind of a collaboration that that Jaegher started. He brought us together, if you will, and we thought our combination worked well to just better understand Tourette's research, as well as Tourette's itself, as well as tics, and how to improve certain things based on our collective knowledge. So an earlier version, or a kind of a narrower version, if you will, of this paper has also been presented at the European Society for the Study of Tourette Syndrome, or the ESSTS, which had its annual conference in October earlier this year, and there's a YouTube video of that as well. So we're expanding this with the most important element of the paper, which is letting be. And what we mean by that, we'll get to it later. So we recognize that the principle, that diverse research approaches, theories, and methods make a field of study more capable of addressing a wider range of questions. Therefore, this paper, we set out why a person-centered approach to Tourette's could help solve certain theoretical, clinical, as well as ethical problems in Tourette's research mostly. So it's a reflection of how Tourette's is known and how we can know Tourette's better. So with this work, we aim to improve the empathetic basis for understanding life with Tourette's. And it's not only our background, we also reflect what we've learned from working with people with Tourette's. Yes, so central to the message to this paper is that the lack of is kind of drawing attention to the lack of fundamental engagement with people with Tourette's, as well as an exploration of tics that is not led by preconceived notions. And what that means is also kind of central to the phrase letting be. So Jaegher will now take over and explain, discuss the ethico-philosophical catch-22 of Tourette's.
Thank you, Diana. Trying to figure out how to go from one to another slide, but I think that has been achieved. So basically, what I wanted to just start with is to basically give a little bit of an overview of Tourette. And as you see on the slide, it used to be a prototypically psychoanalytic condition, but it has moved quickly in the end of last century to a prototypically biological or neurological condition. As is in the history of Tourette by Kushner, which is actually a very good book. And this move to a purely neurological way of looking has these twin virtues. It seems that it gives access to exculpation in the sense that it affords to avoid undeserved blame. This has been worked out philosophically by Schröder and by Arpali and Schröder. And it does that together with giving an explanation, a neurological explanation, pinpointing the cause or the etiology of Tourette's inside the brain, where, as it's stated here in the slide, people, at least in philosophy then, pinpointed it in the basal ganglia and said it was some kind of a lack of inhibition. And this explanation is also inherently a promise of finding effective treatments and cures. And this is something that across different mental conditions is seen as mostly positive. But these types of biological deficit explanations, not only in Tourette's, but also in Tourette's, have their drawbacks. And that gets us into some kind of a catch-22 situation. First of all, and this is something I worked around a lot, biological explanations tend to have stigmatizing effects. This has been seen across different diagnoses, from obesity to psychosis and so on and so forth, ADHD, but it's also something which has been replicated in Tourette's. Also, even if people say that there is a clear neurological explanation, there are ongoing discussions on what specifically is the pathophysiological mechanism, and there are also clear indications of epigenetic influences in Tourette, making it not just a matter of purely genetic or neurological disposition. And importantly as well, this purely neurological or individualistic way of seeing Tourette's is at odds with what is seen by the neurodiversity movement as very important, which is that there also is a social model component, social model, and so a social component to disability, so to being disabled by ideas in society rather than just by having something lacking in your brain. And all of these reasons, as Diana already mentioned, give us pause to look a little bit into more person-centered research alternative and to basically shift focus away from disruptive tics, which is typically what is seen by the rest of the world, and basically go back to people with Tourette's and talk with them and let them talk about their whole lived experience. And we will go into this throughout the presentation, but we hope that this opens up to a broader set of phenomena which have been described in relation to Tourette, but which are somehow disconnected from this pure disruptive tics, and we have to deal with tics point of view. And our inspiration here has been and is a lot of autobiographical work which has been published by people with Tourette's, and you see a number of them mentioned in the first bullet and a number of screenshots as well, where people with Tourette's, and I think what is in blue here by Hollenbeck, his phrase is disease of the onlooker, and we will come back to that as well. But basically, these people with Tourette's, just like in the Wilensky, it's clear from the Wilensky cover in the slide, these people are not just saying, well, there is something wrong with my brain, but they're describing a whole suite of experiences they have, which are very much entangled with how their condition is received or their way of behaving is received. And our inspiration is as well looking at what Kristien, for instance, did in the field of autism, that qualitative research, or research which is really listening to the first-person experience of people with Tourette's or people living with people with Tourette's, really has a huge impact. And we see that in autism research, where based on the movement of neurodiversity, we have seen a lot of change in the typical lack of empathy, theory of mind type of theories towards the more open-ended type of theorizing that is now in autism, and that is much more respectful and integrative of the experience of people with autism. With that, I turn it back to Diana, who will talk about her own qualitative research with people with Tourette's. Diana?
Thank you very much. Yes, so I did a qualitative study with 15 people with Tourette's in the Netherlands and Belgium back in 2015, 2016 for my doctorate. And the book cover you see there is kind of the most comprehensive work, if you will, that reports on this this study. Obviously, my doctorate report itself can be accessed, but this is forthcoming. It says on the website in February, but I think it's coming out earlier. This study, and in the vein of this paper, it kind of remarks on two empirical tensions of a lack of inhibition model, which governs most Tourette's research. and this is the premise on which I did my study, including on my sister's experience, Laura Beljaars, who is probably familiar to some of you. And she allows me to talk about her experience in this way, and in my book, and to you as an audience as well. So I'm a human geographer, so I look at spatial patterns of aspects of human life, and trying to understand more about these phenomena by looking at them spatially. So context and compulsion here are two tensions. So one, the context, in terms of the lack of inhibition model, the context cannot, or the model cannot account for the difference in context that people find themselves in. So different social environments dictate what, how many, and how often tics are deemed inappropriate. Obviously, you see differences between what people do in their bedroom when they're alone, for instance, and what they are able to do and what they feel comfortable doing in churches, for instance. In addition, frequency and intensity of tics have been proven to differ strongly between activities, and there isn't too much research on in kind of conventional Tourette's studies, but my study does suggest that as well, and we'll see that later on in a short clip that I have. And Specht et al. have argued that conditions of stress negatively affect how acutely the urge to tic is felt, and the threshold at which one must give in to doing a tic is also very much related to context. And having worked with one particular person who I would be observing in my study, she said, "Oh, I will show you everything. I will show you all my tics. I will not hold back any." And then when we did the observation, she couldn't. So there was a level of, there was a kind of a stressful moment, a certain kind of context that mediated her tics in a way that certain ones came out and other ones did not come out. So that suggests how Tourette's is in a certain way as well, or that context is a problem. The other thing, the other empirical tension of the lack of inhibition model is the feeling of compulsion itself. So as a sense of just rightness or not just rightness, which indicates how tics need to be performed. So it, especially with kind of interactive tics, it suggests this feeling suggests, or this is not how it should be. This mug on my desk should be pointing another way. Therefore, the tic is to change it a little bit. So that model does not really kind of fully pick up on that. Also, not ticking leads to increasing urges and growing awareness of the element that is not just right. So if you hold it back, the sensation would rise or would kind of increase in a way. And we take lots of inspiration for this from the 1980s article by Joseph Bliss, who worked with Mary Roberts, amongst others, to really explain this and to put this in words, which is really difficult, of course. So these tensions trouble the explanatory power of a Tourettic person's capacity to inhibit tics as comprehensive theory of why people tic. So following a person-centered approach, in my study, I've looked at the combination of context and compulsion. So the aim of that study was to explore how we can go from the environment being seen as a factor of how Tourette's is to really seeing how the environment creates Tourette's, if you will. So it's a kind of a vice versa a narrative, and it demonstrates just how strongly tics can be related to one's environment. If we go to the next slide. These are two quotes from two people I've worked with. So the first one is, this man told me that, did I tell you about stacking those round balls the other day? I can have balls with the same color and blue stack. I can't have balls with the same color blue stacked on top of each other. Another color ball always needs to be in between. So this is a tic that is very much related to that situation, that context, and that sense of not just rightness. And he was talking about dog balls because he had a large number of dogs, including balls. And the second one from a woman, 35 at that point, she said, I think I need surfaces, books too. I always have to glide my hand over the cover. And walls, I have to stroke the walls in her house and brush the pillows. So she explains that she would lie in bed and put her hand behind her and then just stroke the wall, and that would be calming, but that would also be a tic. Yeah, surfaces that you can feel with your whole hand. Tips and points aren't really what I do, which is oppositional to what other people have told me. Thank you. So what it does, these failures, is that failing to consider context of compulsion reproduces Tourette's as a pathological problem, which is quite frankly quite the aim of what Tourette's has been made into, and what we seek to kind of move away from. So one that is reduced to a quantification of observable and mainly stereotypical face, neck, and upper torso tics by onlookers in standardized laboratory or diagnostic conditions, which then results in the tip of the iceberg. And this is a furthering of neuropsychiatric and psychological structures of thought. So Tourette's fits into these structures rather than Tourette's creating these structures around it, structures of knowledge. But the problem is that they have an ableist and an eugenicist root, and they cannot be separate. You cannot separate those structures from the original intent of these structures. The lived experience reports are thus not only reduced to secondary confirmatory evidence, it leads to an erasure of the phenomena below the water level, so the inherent situatedness of tics, and the interconnections between phenomena such as rage, obsessions, and tic attacks, which we argue is Tourette's as well. Although not a diagnostic criteria, it is part of the Tourette's experience, if you will. So taking this forward is the 4E trend that Jo and then Hanne will discuss next. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I'm trying to see whether I can get myself. I hope you can see me on my screen. It's a little bit scrambled, so I will just briefly introduce how we believe, and then we have Hanne, who is really a leading expert in an active philosophy. But basically, what the ideas that Diana mentioned on situatedness, on embodying the relational and situational aspects of Tourette's, lead us to say, well, we have to look at this from this recent 4E trend, so embodied, embedded, and active and extended, and not just focus on, let's say, what is wrong or whatever inside the brain, the pathology of it, but look at how this gets created, how this gets created in experience between, let's say, a Tourettic body and its environment, and how basically the relation between those two, let's say, creates the overall experience. I will not go too much in detail further on this slide, because we have Hanne, and Hanne really is, as I said, a leading expert in active philosophy. So she will introduce the concept letting be and how it connects ultimately to this qualitative work on Tourette. Hanne?
unmute, that helps. Yes, thank you, Yu. Yeah, so indeed, in the embodied approach and the enactive and distributed and extended approach to cognition, it's important to look at people's whole bodies to understand that our whole body plays a role in how we understand the world and how we relate with the world. And this context, this embeddedness or situatedness in the world is also crucial to understand. So what we do is not just reducible to our brains or even to behavior that we can see. We have to understand a living being in its whole context. And there's I'm just wanting to here give a very brief, quick introduction to actually what I think is a critical trend in 4E cognitive sciences, which goes quite a bit beyond embodiment and embeddedness, I think. And this is also evident in Jo and Kristien's work and many other people, that the lived experience of people is very important. So this is the phenomenological body, the experience of someone in their full complex context is something that we not only investigate, but relate to ourselves as investigators. And that, I think, is the real new next step, that we as investigators are engaged in this. And that's what I want to explain a little bit here. Could you put the next slide, Jo? Thank you. Yeah, so even in an embodied cognitive science, there are two problems still. And I even think that in the enactive approach in which I work, which I think is one of the most advanced ones, there are still two problems going on. And one is that even embodied cognitive science, but also other aspects of cognitive science and psychiatry and psychology and neuroscience and so on, start from the idea that there's one cognition or one mind or one body even, which we theorize and conceptualize and think about, but it is one model which we seem to assume is the same for everyone. And we do that uncritically. We don't necessarily see the differences between different bodies, how we show up differently because we are different bodies. And that's a big problem, because in that way, it's hard to relate between or across difference, or to see the lived experience of people who are not Western, adult, able, and male, actually, but all of that is a whole big discussion. Anyway, we need to de-universalize the body and look at particular cognition in particular situations. And another problem is that we haven't really understood human knowing, I think, in these cognitive sciences, which are about knowing, because it starts a lot from the supposedly high level or highest possible capacities. Could we have the next slide, Jo? Thank you. Yeah. So the general idea in cognitive sciences is we look up to this pinnacle of cognition that lies in things like planning and language and mathematics and categorization and making distinctions. But that's an element or an aspect or a layer of human knowing that is abstract, computational, based on logic. And in a way, it's reductive, it's reduced to some individual things that we seem to control as individuals. It's technological, it's hegemonic, and it's based on this false idea of universality, of one body that we all supposedly should aim for having or should suppose that we have. And if someone doesn't have that, if something is wrong with their cognition, then that's a kind of a problem in that area that needs to be brought up to this standard of logical, rational knowing. And that's problematic. So I'm proposing with the next slide that we can look at another pinnacle of human knowing, which we all know very well from our experience of being in the world, but which the cognitive sciences have missed out on. And this is this engaged knowing, which is what happens in concrete situations. So not just abstract reasoning and so on, but it's an engaged knowing happening in particular situations. It's where we engage with the world, and this is risky, it's participatory, it involves ourselves and other people deeply, and so it's always inherently ethical. And this is also much at the basis of what we're trying to do in this paper, that this way of understanding each other and how we relate to each other in cognitive science and in theory is ethical at the core. If we could have the next slide. So we need a different epistemology that does justice to this engaged human knowing. And in the next slide, I will explain it a bit more. So it's inspired by a really interesting paper by Kim McLaren, who talks about the problem of letting things be. And she gives the example of a horse that's being trained by its trainer. It's being trained very, very hard. The trainer has the goal with this interaction and with his animal to make money. And that's what he trains it for. But he forgoes the being of the horse as also a playful animal that needs to roam and play and that has an actual lively interaction with its world. And so the training of this horse has gone wrong because of a non-recognition of the horse as a living being with its necessities and wants and desires and intentions and lively way of being in the world. And the fact that we can do something like that so wrongly, because this horse, when it's trained so badly, can become ill, means for Kim McLaren, and this is a really interesting point, that we learn this letting be from letting others be, from interacting with other people. So if you could press the next slide, Jo. Yes. So letting others be is really the place where we learn this way of understanding cognition in which we let another person or another being be what they are, while also interacting with them. And that's a deep tension between these two things. And I should skip this slide, I think, because we don't have, I think it's getting too long, but it's okay, this is not so. So the essence of this letting be approach is that we encounter a phenomenon like Tourette's or like autism, or actually in people that we meet, which is really great, I think, about the work that is being done by Diana and you and Daniel and Kristien and other people, that it's about how we meet each other. And there is a tension in that because we are meeting difference or someone who is very different. And what do we do with this difference in terms of understanding what it is, what Tourette's is, so that it can be what it is and we don't over-determine it by trying to make it into something that we have decided beforehand is in a certain way. So there's a tension between the phenomenon that we let be and our engagement with it, changing it. And this is something that's unavoidable, but it's something that we have to be very careful with and aware of, that this transformation of the phenomenon and ourselves in relation, in this epistemological relation, this relation of trying to understand, that these transformations happen in this interaction, in this engagement. So could we have the next slide? So letting be is this tension of letting and being and engaging. So it's not letting be, when I say that, sometimes people think of what I call the Beatles approach to letting be, but that's not what it is here. It's not a disengaging, right? That's this kind of, so let it be could be an invitation to disengage, but in this frame where we are talking about epistemology and cognitive science, it's exactly not a disengaging. It's particularly an engaging that does justice to this tension. And so it's not an over-determining of a phenomenon, but it is engaging and it holds or entails paradox. And both the knower and the known, the phenomenon and the scientist or the psychologist or the psychiatrist, continually change, as does their relation. And being aware of that and following that process is a way of understanding the phenomenon that we are arguing could be helpful also for understanding Tourette's. And so the fact that all of us are continually becoming, and we do that in participation by which we mutually transform, is really central to this approach. And with this, I give it back to you. And
thank you, Hanne. So I've reproduced Hanne's last slide as a reminder and getting back to Tourette's. So I changed the question mark into an exclamation mark, and I try here quickly to say what letting be means in the context of Tourette's. So it's letting go of over-determining and forcing people to really fit this idea of only being characterized by disruptive tics, which are basically those things in the experience of Tourette's which are noticeable to us, to the onlookers, but which are not necessarily the experience that people with Tourette's themselves have. But it is not a disengaging or an underdetermining or a letting go. We do want to listen to problems, and obviously people with Tourette's report problems, so we want to listen to that. It's not saying, well, it is what it is, just deal with it and we move on. But doing this without reducing Tourette's to problems. And then this idea of becoming and participation, which Hanne also referred to, is really trying to understand the Tourettic experience, trying to relate to it, even if there is clearly a difference between people who have Tourette's and other people. We can acknowledge that difference without saying, well, this is totally strange to us. We cannot relate to it. We have to put it in a bin somewhere in the corner with things that are very radically different from us. And actually, I'm trying to go to the next slide, but I went one slide too far, I think. Yes. What it allows us to do is to make new sense of Tourettic sensitivity. And it allows us to look also at the positive elements that are often reported together with Tourette's, spontaneity, creativity, thinking out of the box, and so on and so forth. But it also tries to explain Tourette's in terms of basic human sensitivities. And these are things which in autobiographical reports or in the report by Bliss are things which are regularly reported by people with Tourette's to try to refer to their experience as the experience of scratching an itch. And specifically the book which I have here, which is an old book written and edited by people with Tourette's, they give this idea, which is very close to the idea of compulsion that Diana talked about, of picture Tourette's as somebody saying, don't think about monkeys. If somebody says, don't think about monkeys, there is a whole story about that, which I will forego, but you can order the book. Then, well, obviously you think about monkeys. And this is something which Diana got out of her qualitative research, that, well, there is this kind of idea of something is not just right, and this is a mounting pressure, and we cannot make sense of this mounting pressure. We can make sense ourselves of this mounting pressure, even if we don't have Tourette's. And this is actually something that people with Tourette's, like the book cover here, demonstrates want us to do. And very importantly, it connects to something which this phrase that I reported earlier of Hollenbeck, this idea of disease of the onlooker, that it is not something that just a neurological pinpointing it inside the brain is not something which accords to the Tourettic experience. They really experience this within, let's say, a societal or relational perspective. They are really acutely aware, as we will go into, as to whether or not people pick up on certain tics or could pick up on certain tics and how it would influence people's views of them. And this is something going to my own research. When I started my PhD project, I basically, from the tradition of autism, I really wanted to do participatory research in the sense of asking people with Tourette's, what do you think needs to be researched broadly in the idea of neuroepigenetics project and responsibility? And what emerged from them is really that what they face, what their experience is this focus on living with Tourette's, on having a reasonable quality of life, with Tourette's. And that is also, by the way, something which is in normal empirical research also there, that the impairment of Tourette's, the felt impairment, is something not quite one-to-one with the tic severity, whilst most of the science is really built around tic severity, and as Diana said, quantifying tics and quantifying tics that are quantifiable and stereotypical. So what people with the people with whom I talked at the beginning of my projects, they were not just interested in treating or curing tics, they were interested in how does my ticking or my Tourette's influence how other people view me? What is the impact of trying not to be seen as somebody with Tourette's, or trying to avoid having to disclose that I have Tourette's? And I just want to suggest in the next 2 slides that just keeping your ears open for that kind of report dramatically changes this picture that we started off in a purely neurological view of a lack of inhibition to reports, lived experience reports, which are really focusing on a surplus of inhibition. I have 2 quotes here that are also in the paper that we wrote that really indicate, in the first case, this is somebody who went to an event and that really contained their tics for a long time, to the point in time that when she exited the event and she really could tic without hurting or creating havoc, that she really suffered a completely disabling tic attack. The other quote is from somebody who needs to present for an audience, and every time he basically irons himself out to not be ticking, to not have to explain why he is ticking, to not have to explain why that he has Tourette's, to not have to disclose it. And that is a lot of energy which he cannot spend in his performance as well. And I asked him, but isn't your audience educated enough to look through that? And he said, well, they're all very educated people, and I'm sure they're all very open-minded, but I just know, I feel that if I tic, that people will say, well, good presentation despite of the ticking, and so on and so forth. So there is really a surplus of inhibition that is going on. And sometimes, certainly in the popular view of Tourette's, but sometimes also in scientific articles, there is this idea of a lack of sensitivity, that people do inappropriate things which are hurtful to others. And if I listen to the people that I talked to, it was really apparent that there is a surplus of sensitivity as well, in the sense not just in being open to the environment, as Diana talked about, and as we can theoretically look into, but really that they are very sensitive to how others view them, and that is something that really gets inside of their heads, and also directly impacts their quality of life with Tourette's. So before I give it over to Diana for the conclusion and the significance of this type of approach, I just want to go back to the first slide that I presented. And I think without having done all of the work, I think it is possible that if we look in this person-centered way, if we let Tourette's be, that we can get to a solution where stigma is decreased, where there is neither undeserved blame, nor this kind of, there is something wrong in the brain, and therefore people are, let's say, lacking something or something, and come to, as research, stigma research shows, come to something like, this is really an extreme manifestation of a basic human tendency, which is basically something which is seen as much less stigmatizing. It also, in line with neuroepigenetics, it allows to integrate epigenetic findings, both as to the frequency and the kind of tics that are there. But also, maybe it explains the good prognosis that is generally, not always, but generally found in Tourette's, and that is not, as sometimes is said, is a matter of a maturing brain or a brain that is coping, but that actually is something that the environment of people with Tourette's basically is growing up to accept, to let the people with Tourette's be, and to give tics a place without, let's say, over or under determining them. And finally, before we go to Diana and the signification, it is something which is very much compatible with the neurodiversity view of Tourette's. Letting be is an approach which takes the focus off combating tics, not that we want to take the focus completely off, if that is something that is important, but that takes the focus, the sole focus, away from combating tics, and really integrates the idea that we have to educate the onlooker as well, which is totally compatible with the social model of disability. And with that, I give the floor to Diana, and I will switch on my light. Diana?
Thank you, Jo. Yes, so what we propose then for Tourette's is to turn this iceberg upside down, the one we showed you before, to no longer see Tourette's only from a detached onlooker point of view and focus on its pathological tics, but to also become more sensitive to the issues that Tourette people experience in their lives, which also means a more profound research engagement with the social sciences and humanities, such as ourselves. And Daniel, actually. So clinically, this comes down to allowing the Tourettic person to decide what they find problematic and to develop a more situationally sensitive treatment, if that is what they want. So to really to engage with to engage with the context, with compulsion, with these internal differences of the condition and the experience of Tourette's, what Jo and Hanne also got at. So ethically, and this is, I guess, perhaps the most important thing in terms of research ethics, letting Tourette's be then encompasses a new openness to variation, including potential opposition, an openness to the new, if you will. So how Tourette's is understood and what is helpful to those with Tourettic sensibilities should be open to change, as Hanne said, rather than to be expanded within rigid knowledge structures that have to be worked with and mediated. So it follows then that this position entails that also society ought to be clinically engaged with or treated itself, if that is what people with Tourette's want, and it seems like they do. So society needing to adapt and change should also be inherently part of Tourette's research and in the way Tourette's finds a space and has a space within society. So by centering the person with Tourette's, which is what we've been advocating here, paradoxically means expanding to their context, to their social context, and to the societies we live in. We see that currently this position is perhaps most relevant, more relevant than it has been perhaps in the previous years, with the current controversy between scientists who are very keen on holding on to the structures that are there, and people with Tourette's who have found a community, of knowledge creation, kind of challenging certain things and being met with hostility from these older structures. So the democratization of what Tourette's is, what knowledge of Tourette's is found interesting and valuable and important is kind of now up in the air a little bit. hence why this letting be can be a way of kind of making this changing the way of engagement from the scientific community, if you will, one of love rather than of distrust and mistrust. So this is our presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And Jo will now continue to moderate the session, and he will introduce our respondent speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll switch my view. So I have the pleasure. Well, normally we had the three respondents. Kristien will replace Jean, but we went a little bit over time, so maybe we can catch up a little bit there. The first respondent I want to introduce is Kristien Cornelia, and I'll let her introduce the very specific, but she's a Tourette's researcher, psychologist at the University of Minnesota. And as Diana referred to at the end of the conclusion, sometimes people in Tourette research have a little bit of a closed mind. And Kristien, together with Diana, myself, a lot of others, including Daniel, already put a response into that, trying to keep an open mind in science. So I give the floor to you, Kristien, and yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and for such a thought-provoking discussion. I'm very excited to be a part of this and to have had the opportunity to work with some of you already. And so I just put these up so that you're not only listening to my voice, but I wanted to center my comments around three themes. And the first is this importance of integrative approaches. And so and I should say I'm a clinical psychologist. I have been working in the Tourette's field for about 15 years. And when I first started working in the field, I was part of the research group that was doing the behavioral intervention CBIT trials. And so I came in at sort of the era of a backlash from a purely neurological approach, right, to saying, well, we know that Tourette's is quite impacted by context and the environment, and behavioral interventions might be helpful. And so I sort of came in that era. I've done a lot of research looking at how the environment impacts tic frequencies. So like as alluded to in the paper, some of that research that uses videos to quantify observable tics. And then I have since moved into more of an integrative approach. So trying to understand how it is that the brain and the environment interact together to influence symptoms, and how we can use both methods in treatment. So, I just want to highlight what I think is the importance of not framing Tourette's work in these categorical ways of biology versus social and contextual, because I think, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, but I don't think these are at odds with each other. I see them as sort of they are looking at different aspects of Tourette, of the person experiencing Tourette, and how they influence each other, I think is a very interesting question. And so I worry about us sort of creating these artificial camps, or sort of splitting off and saying that, biology isn't relevant to these things, because I think we have seen historically in Tourette's the limitations of holding these sort of things at odds with each other, and instead coming together and saying, like Diana beautifully put at the end, how can the humanities, psychology, neuroscience come together with centering those individuals with Tourette to really understand the complexities around this condition. Because I think sort of settling into one or another of these models runs the risk of oversimplifying what is a very complex condition. And so I really agree this importance of it being informed by and serving the needs of those with Tourette, and that has not been historically a part of the biomedical model, which tends to be quite hierarchical, to sort of see the scientist clinician as the expert, whereas the patient is the one coming to the expert for help. And I think leveling that hierarchy in this work is really important, especially in treatment work. So as an example, a group of us in the US a couple years ago did a project called Treating Tourette Together. It was focused on this CBIT, comprehensive behavioral intervention for Tourette's. And we through a series of surveys and an in-person meeting with people with Tourette, including children, adults, caregivers, clinicians, and scientists, had a meeting to really discuss what is the future of this intervention? What are its limitations? How can we make it more responsive to the needs of people who are coming to us for treatment? And that was a little bit of a reaction I had to the paper as a clinician. I do have a lot of patients coming to me that are asking for help with their tics because they are distressing to themselves. They might interrupt them as they're trying to do a task like reading. They can cause pain. And so I think we need to sort of land on how do we hold this space of letting it be, but also have something to offer people who are asking for help. And so I think these kinds of models of coming together are really important, as well as I think was highlighted, the importance of societal intervention. So it can be really difficult in the clinical space to disentangle what are the needs of this individual versus should the intervention lie in their social network, right? I have seen plenty of people who have very significant tics, but are in a very understanding, welcoming environment. Everybody knows that they have Tourette and they're not as distressed. And so I think there is an importance in holding both those things. I also want to be careful about us not pitting quantitative versus qualitative methods against each other. And again, thinking about integrative methods and recognizing that they're answering different questions that I don't think are at odds with each other. To sort of maybe defend a little bit some of the work that I have done looking at, measuring observable tics, there are some benefits of that type of measurement in that it can let us ask pretty specific questions. Like, for example, I did a study where we did, there's a lot of patients report that stress makes their tics worse. So we did a study where we did bring people into the lab. We did video measurement while they were letting their tics happen, trying to suppress, and then while those things were happening, concurrent to a stress induction. And what we found was that the tics did not increase during the stress, but they became more difficult to suppress. And so that finding was important to us. And I think I explain that a lot to patients to help them understand that your Tourette is not getting worse when you're stressed. It just makes it more difficult for you to be able to manage your symptoms. And so I think there can be ways that we can use that research that is helpful, and centering those questions on what patients are interested in is important. And I think, there is a good evidence base that shows that using these quantitative methods, exactly what Diana is very consistent with Diana's research, showing that aspects of context of the environment have a huge influence on tics. And so I think thinking forward to how do we complement these kinds of methods that we're using with the ones that researchers like Diana are using would really benefit us as a field. So the second theme I have is around just aligning this perspective with the neuroscience of Tourette's. And so I'm going to push back a little bit on the model that was in the paper, because I think it's not a complete representation of what the current neuroscientific model of Tourette is. And so I want to first just tackle this idea of the lack of inhibition model. And this word inhibition in this model is much more technical than I think is how it was discussed here. So I think we could, on the one hand, colloquially, inhibition, we think of it as like our ability to control our behaviors. In the biological model, what it's referring to is that in the basal ganglia, there are neurons that when active have an inhibitory effect on the neurons they're connected to, right? So when they are active, they are releasing neurotransmitters that decrease the likelihood that the next neuron will fire. And so what this word is referring to is that those inhibitory neurons are not, they're disinhibited, and people who have Tourette, they're more likely to be, which then causes disinhibition or hyperexcitability of the cortex, so the areas of the motor system. So I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but to make this point that I do think as we have crosstalk across disciplines, something I have noticed is we have to be really careful about defining for each other what our terms are so that we're not missing each other. So for example, I started doing work with a neuroscientist and we were using the word reinforcement. And I realized that we had different definitions, and having a clarifying conversation about what do you mean when you say this word, I think is really important for these approaches. So in this case, the word inhibition is not meant to be that the person can't control their behaviors. It's a very specific word about neurons functioning. And what the neuroscience research does actually show is that is consistent with your talk. People with Tourette are better at tasks that require inhibition of a motor response. And so if you do a task where, let's say you prime someone to have a response and their job is, let's say, okay, when you see this letter, hit this button unless you hear a sound that tells you not to. What we see is people with Tourette are actually, they're better at learning motor sequences, they're better at inhibiting motor behaviors. And we think this is because of and that ability improves with age. And so we think that's because they have more practice inhibiting because of having Tourette's, just like you're saying, right? In these situations where they are feeling the need to inhibit, it actually strengthens the neural systems that enable them to downregulate tics. So I think these are very complementary. I also, the current models, I think, are not as sort of controversial as I think was presented. I think there's a lot of convergence across literature of the neural systems that are involved in Tourette, and that they are really these interactive effects of a lot of different neural circuits. So I just want to caution us, again, as we're crossing fields, to not oversimplify or to assume something about another field's model, and instead to kind of come to the table with an open mind of, okay, what is it that your model contends, and how can we sort of think about, because I think there's much more alignment here than was suggested. And finally, I do see working sort of in this neuroscience world that there is a big movement away from a deficits model to strengths profiles, to thinking about, rather than what is deficient about this group of people, thinking about what are some strengths that we can leverage to help them in a way that meets their own needs in treatment. And also there's a big move away from group differences. So this, like, comparing people with Tourette's to people who don't have Tourette's, to instead understanding individuals. And this really gets at the flipped iceberg Diana showed of, it's not just tics. Most of these individuals have other psychiatric disorders. And so, for example, in neuroimaging, there's a big movement away from comparing a group to another group, and instead doing these new techniques that let you map individual brain systems and brain networks and use tasks to measure behavior at an individual level to look at strengths. So I think, again, this is sort of a positive that if I think about how do we pair those things about what we can know about an individual's biology with what we can know about an individual's social experience, for example, that could be very interesting and informative. And finally, behavior is a result of a dynamic interaction between the brain and the environment. And so I see no incompatibility with what was presented here in biological models, these are all influencing each other, right? We know experiences, contextual factors influence the brain. They change the brain in turn has an effect on what behavior looks like. So again, I think thinking of these as dynamic systems. I also wanted to note that behavioral treatment is not at odds with a biological model. This was a little bit suggested in the paper, and I think this is an important issue that comes up a lot in behavioral treatment for Tourette. We have to remember that a lot of biological, for lack of a better term, biological illnesses respond very well to behavioral interventions because those engage biological processes, right? So we know that, for example, in cardiac rehab after a heart attack, behavioral interventions have a huge impact on how well people do. So I think, again, we have to be careful to not say because a behavioral intervention works for something, biology doesn't matter. They're interactive. And finally, my last theme is around this importance of dimensional constructs. And I think this was stated very nicely in the paper, this word neurogradual approach, which I loved. And I do think there is a big shift away from thinking it within, at least this is a picture of in the US, the National Institute of Mental Health has this framework called research domain criteria. And so the idea here is that categorical understanding of behavior, psychiatric functioning, so studying people based on the DSM criteria for disorders is really limited, and it misses out on exactly what was discussed here, right? This idea that in reality, these processes are not categorical. Someone is not healthy versus not healthy, Tourettic versus not Tourettic. And so I think this is a really crucial perspective to bring in when we talk about all of these things. And so from my work as a sort of integrative behavioral neuroscientist, I'm not a neuroscientist, I talk to neuroscientists, I would say. I'm fluent in neuroscience. That moving away from it, and Diana alluded to this current controversy around like tics versus functional tics. And I think these categories are not going to benefit the people we are trying to serve in any way. And here instead is really an opportunity to say, what are the dimensions? And this, I'm sure there are other dimensions that people like those of you in the social science, the humanities could add to this, but this is sort of the model that NIMH proposed, is instead of saying, is this a tic or a functional tic or, psychogenic or not, saying, okay, what are the different systems that can underlie these behaviors? So things like, motor control, cognitive control over behavior, social learning, social decision-making, sensitivity to environmental feedback, reinforcement learning, like was alluded to, like sensory sensitivity. These are all spectra. And so instead of thinking about where is an individual in this bucket or that bucket, moving toward where does an individual fall across all these different dimensions, and recognizing that there isn't going to be people that are exactly the same across these dimensions. So I think there's opportunity to really think about these neurodevelopmental conditions within these dimensions and dimensions of functioning. And again, coming back to the central importance of including individuals with Tourette's, centering them and sort of saying, what are the areas of functioning that me as a treatment provider that I can help you with, or that are causing you to struggle, that you want help with, and what are the things that aren't, or what are your strengths, and how do we grow those capacities? So I will close there, and thank you again for including me in this discussion.
Thank you, Kristien. That was really insightful. I would like to respond, and maybe Diana and Hanne as well, but I think it's more courteous to first give the floor to Daniel and make sure that we don't have him rush. So Daniel, you have the floor.
Brilliant. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, sure. I don't have any slides, unfortunately. But yeah, so yeah, first I just wanted to thank everyone who's spoken so far. I just thought all the discussions have been really interesting. And there's so much to think about. And ultimately, I'm just really glad that these conversations, are happening within academia and across disciplines. I think that's really exciting. But yeah, so my name is Daniel Jones. My pronouns are he, him. And I'm currently conducting research into the embodied experiences of public spaces. So that's both online and physical for those who have a diagnosis of Tourette's syndrome. So for context as well, I also have a diagnosis of Tourette's syndrome with my symptoms including coprolalia and copropraxia, so be aware of that. So basically my approaches and thoughts are going to be significantly influenced by my positionality in that sense. So yeah, I guess coming from social sciences, specifically human geography perspective, I suppose my approach to these issues is kind of more naturally in line with the approaches called for in the paper. And I feel like it's very much what I'm trying to focus on doing in my PhD thesis right now. So I'm glad that this paper exists for sure. But yeah, I suppose first things first, I wanted to stress how strongly I feel in agreement with the call for this person-focused approach to Tourette's syndrome research. And I wanted to say also in summary that this paper is, I would say, significantly indicative of the need for Tourette's syndrome or Tourette's research to embrace the interdisciplinary and to consider this interdisciplinary work not only as valid but as vital. And I think the paper offers a really interesting and important suggestion, or many important suggestions, and I'm, as a Tourettic person myself, I'm happy to see those. But yes, so I guess in terms of my main points of response, I suppose my initial point to this paper is relating to the the idea that these research methods that we use are crucial in determining the research that we conduct into Tourette's and into Tourettic communities. So within the social sciences, creative methodological approaches have been frequently used to explore and platform and analyze and represent the lived experiences of a variety of marginalized groups. So that's including things from the use of poetry to dance to photography. Ultimately the use of these creative methodologies in the social sciences has such an extensive history, notably in participatory research that really involves these communities of interest or these marginalized groups in the planning of the specific research projects as well. And so, I guess regarding attentively listening in an to the Tourettic community in an academic context, perhaps, I'd say it's no longer enough to urge or hint towards the need, for the consideration of interdisciplinary, but to demand that it is the approach that we take going forward. And I think what's suggested in this paper, obviously is this changing of focus and how it has these important theoretical implications, but I'm losing my train of thought here, but basically, I just want to say that interdisciplinarity in even the design phases of our research when it comes to the epistemology and ontological approaches to our research is vital for moving the study of Tourette's forwards. And I guess I just wanted to chat about my own research to kind of use it for context. Yeah, so in my own research, I've been using a range of creative methods, most notably zine making, and I found that so much more valuable information has come to light through using this methodological approach. So for those who might not be so familiar, zines are basically small circulation, self-published works of original and reused texts or images, poems, things like that. And zine making has been used in this participatory research approach with marginalized groups quite a lot in the social sciences. They're inherently messy, as they're often like cut and paste and things, and just photocopied for distribution. And I'd say that's quite appropriate for the study of what I think is quite, a messy, confusing, conflicting disability. Yeah, and I think that they're powerful and political, and all around, I just think the zines and this specific creative method is a really good way of involving the members of this community in the production of a narrative that they're comfortable with and that they want to be out there. Zines, yeah, are basically just a really great means of alternative knowledge production via, this engaged knowing and deep involvement of Tourettic people, or simply, they can also just be kind of accessible forms of autobiographical narrative too. And I'd argue that they're instrumental in ensuring that we're actually listening to our participants, and not just on like a surface level. So with my research, interestingly, when I've been pairing these zine making workshops with follow-up interviews, I found that those of my participants, through the process of this research project, have been able to reflect on their own experiences of Tourette's syndrome. And I would say to some extent, they've used other words, but to some extent, it seems that my participants have kind of almost talked to me about how this letting be has kind of occurred as results methods, and how they've like allowed each individual to slowly discover, what Tourette's syndrome is, or what it is to them, in a way that moves past a focus on tics. Because obviously, academic writing and literature isn't always accessible to these communities. And actually, this has been to such a point where, participants in my work have unanimously expressed frustration over this focus on tics in the research to do with Tourette's syndrome. And that's despite conversations that happened at the beginning of the project about experiences of Tourette's syndrome that basically just revolved around their tics. So using this method has almost changed the way that they're just talking about, or my participants are talking about Tourette's syndrome as well, in a way that it is moving them past just considering tics as well, if that makes sense. And yet they've expressed this frustration with this focus on tics at the expense of the consideration of this whole experience of being Tourettic, or fully considering Tourettic life worlds, so to speak. And obviously I feel like this lines up with this aforementioned 4E approach in the cognitive sciences. And I guess it could also be argued as what is considered as a post-phenomenological approach to the body within the social sciences. So a significant portion of my current and previous participants, yeah, like I said, they've expressed how much they've learned about Tourette's and about themselves or their own experiences through this project. And one of my participants used the phrase life-changing in a follow-up interview when discussing what they had learned about themselves. Am I still here? Everything okay? I saw someone move. Okay. I thought it had frozen, sorry. Gosh, where was I? Yeah, so I guess further to this, I guess clearly significant and important experience of self-discovery amongst participants, and even myself, I'd say, that the creative methodological approach has allowed, allowing participants to be the ones in control of the narratives of Tourettic lived experiences, has really been beneficial for me in ensuring that I'm not just simply listening, but attentively listening to these participants as this paper is calling for. And so, yeah, I just think the use of these alternative creative methods paired with other methods as well in interdisciplinary ways is something that is super useful to consider when we're thinking about the future of methodological design for research with Tourettic people and communities. And yeah, about how we can not only listen to, but actively involve this community in the production of knowledge, so to speak. So yeah, using methods and designing our research in a way that allows Tourettic people control and autonomy to some extent over certain research projects in question, and in ways that value their desires rather than just kind of considering them in the process, is vital to academic inquiry into Tourette's. And I think this is especially the case with any work that we do seek to publish, whether that's, you know, in a journal, in the form of a book, and so on. And like, as we know, academic and peer-reviewed literature, it has a significant influence over the design of services, as we've kind of already discussed, whether that's like from support groups to treatment plans and so on. And so, yeah, I'd argue that this paper doesn't just reframe the ways in which we should be approaching the research ethically and theoretically, but I'd argue that this person-centered approach also, you know, alters the ways in which services for Tourettics like myself are just could be designed as a whole. And I think, yeah, the paper raises the need for listening to Tourettics and their account of their own lived experiences in a way that does this. And it calls, you know, for a placing of Tourettics as experts by experience on Tourette syndrome, which I think is really important. Obviously, again, as we've discussed, Tourette syndrome is very nuanced and individualistic. Like, no one person is having the same experience. Yet, as has been done in the past with other disabilities, research has previously tried to come to mass over generalizations or conclusions about entire, you know, Tourettic populations, or you know, communities within that Tourettic population. And I won't go into too much detail about, you know, there's one, you know, one particular argument about TikTok that's going around at the moment that I think is illustrative of that. But yeah, that aside, by listening attentively to individual experiences and narratives and stories, as the paper is calling for, we can not only move academic research forwards, but I think it has really, it potentially has like massive positive implications for, you know, improving the quality of services available for Tourettics. So lots of my participants have expressed a significant lack of services, whether that's the quality or the quantity, and that's specifically in the UK. And yeah, I think I'm over talking too much, so I am going to kind of come to an end on that point. But my second kind of main point, moving on from the, you know, use of these like creative methods, perhaps, I just wanted to expand on the potential alterations required in services. I do want to urge caution with the idea of letting Tourette's be, and the allowance of gradual finding out of what Tourette's is and what it is on its own terms. And I think it is a really important approach, and I think it has a lot of benefits, but I do think we should be cautious if we think about ideas of Tourettic self-discovery here, and hopefully I'll kind of clarify what I mean by that in a second, in a way that makes sense for you. So to reflect on my own lived experience here, my diagnosis of Tourette syndrome was hidden from me to a certain extent. And so whilst I pretty much figured out eventually that I had Tourette syndrome, I felt that my experience wasn't valid precisely due to the lack of services available to me whilst on this journey of Tourettic self-discovery as somebody who, you know, didn't know or didn't think that they did have an official diagnosis of Tourette's. I'd say the trauma that I experienced as a result of the lack of professional support, the support of communities and so on throughout this journey was significant. And I think it was, you know, at that period in my life, quite detrimental to my mental health and overall well-being. And ethically, I'd argue that this approach of, you know, letting Tourette's be is great, but it's only good, I think, if we do sort out what I would describe, at least in the UK, as the absolute shambles that is like the quality and quantity of services that are available for Tourettic people. And that's it with my specific research, particularly in the northeast of England, where there seems to be no services. And the charity that I work with, they have people traveling 4 or 5 hours by car to get there every month just for a support group. So yeah, referring back to my own research again, I obviously mentioned that the creative or overall methodological design of the research project to some extent allowed this letting be of Tourette syndrome and to some extent facilitated, I don't know, a potentially risky journey of self-discovery. And I think it's really important. And actually, it's only through seeing the support that the charity offered for my participants. So it's only through seeing that how I realized that, you know, my own experience, I guess, of letting Tourette's be for, like, personally was, you know, preventable in terms of how traumatic it was and how traumatic it didn't need to be. Like, without having the appropriate services and support in place, we risk allowing more trauma, I think, for those on that journey, if you want to call it that. And so, yeah, we need to ensure that these services are designed in ways that acknowledge that many Tourettics, you know, are also to some extent embarking on this experience of letting Tourette's be in a way that can be damaging, but is preventable. Ultimately, we need better services that are designed around, you know, not only what termed medical professionals deem as the needs of the Tourettic community, but actually we need services designed around what the Tourettic community say that we need, and also further to that, what we want as well. I won't get into the specifics because I could talk forever, and I think I'm already approaching 15 minutes probably. But yeah, I think by approaching Tourette's in a way that centers Tourettics first and foremost, not only in a way that attentively listens to us, but actually platforms Tourettic voices, both individually and collectively, I'd say it doesn't seem so far-fetched to me to suggest that there's potential for every aspect to benefit, be it the services available, that like medical science research, treatment in a way that is wanted, humanities research, and so on. And there's loads I could go into, but the short of it is I'm just really pleased that these conversations are happening. And I just think research with Tourette syndrome is definitely moving in what I deem to be a positive direction. But yeah, thanks for bearing with my rambling thoughts, and thanks for everyone for your for your presentations and reflections so far. Really interesting.
No, thank you, Daniel. So we have neuroscience and art-based methods in the same half an hour, which I think will please Kristien, because that's one of the goals of our project. So Kristien, I don't know, maybe you can respond, and hopefully we have some time left for the audience then.
I'm going to keep it very, very extremely short because because I think the thing that's interesting is already been said by all of you. So I would like to first, really thank you all for the very interesting discussion. And I would also like to thank Jo and Diana and Hanne that they have elaborated on this paper. I think that's great. I think I believe in an academia that is not individual solipsistic, but that is about co-creation. I love that. And I also love that in this lecture we have Kristien and Daniel were there, like you said, art-based methods and neuroscience, psychology, together with philosophers and with human geographers, all together thinking about a specific phenomenon. I think that's great. I think this is the future of this should be the future of science. This should be how research projects are organized, etc., etc. So I think it's great. I loved, Daniel, what you're saying about including experiences through art-based methods. I loved, Kristien, what you were saying about the importance of getting concepts right from the beginning, which is also something we do in our project. I was thinking, the concept of biological. We have this folk concept of biology where we equate often, or specifically in popular media, where we equate biology with genes, with fixed, etc., etc. But I think it would be really cool if scientists from different disciplines would, for example, think about how we conceptualize biology, and maybe whether that's not wrong. All this we can look at biology as really the knowledge of life, of interactions, of dynamics, etc., etc. And I think that's great. And I think, yeah, this approach should, I think, be generalized to each research project, and that would have solved a lot of issues, I guess. I come I've studied autism from a philosophical and ethical perspective for a long time, and I see many analogies, and I'm also very pleased to hear that, yeah, people are moving away from a very, one-sided, purely in the brain approach to a context approach, which is also the way that autism is going. I had some questions, but I'm going to just skip them. You don't have to answer them. You, Diana, and Hanne, just focus on what Kristien and Daniel have said. It interested me how the concept of neurodiversity, how Tourette's would benefit from that, or whether what's the same or the difference with how neurodiversity is conceived right now. So that was one of the questions. Yeah, another question was, it was not really a question because I'm sitting here in the place of Jean Steyart, who was a clinician working with Tourette's, and who, as a clinician, says, well, but okay, there is a lot of the stereotype of Tourette as a very in-brain dysfunction without any context. That's not how we clinicians work. We really also always look at the entire persons and their context, etc. So that's what he would say. But of course, then there is a mismatch between what is done by actual individual researchers like Kristien and by clinicians like Jean, and the discourse that's still often in certain papers, like the papers on the TikTok tics. So that were my two remarks, but I'm going to stop here because I think it's very important to give the floor back to our first speakers, and then of course to the rest of the audience. I think that's more important than.
Thank you. So I'll try to, so we only have 17 minutes left. And I think there are 2 points that I think, one for Daniel, one for Kristien at least, that we have to go into. Maybe Diana and Hanne, you have others, but I'll take those two first. One, I think, is where Daniel ended with his word of caution, which is that, if I interpret it well, that letting be might be interpreted, well, misinterpreted as not providing service, as, okay, let's let them deal with themselves, and it's let them discover it themselves, and that will be the best way to go ahead. And I think I'm going to give the floor to Hanne on that, because I think that's explicitly what we want to avoid. We know the title is a little bit of a provocation, but that is explicitly what we do not want it to mean. The other point, I think, is what Kristien said. I think, Kristien, you also, in the work that we did together, you, Diana, Daniel, and a lot of others, Beten is here as well. I think you're a psychologist, a neuroscientist, but maybe not a typical neuroscientist. And therefore, I would like to respond a little bit to, I think what you say could be, and it could be true that we attack a straw man, but I would like to look a little bit at the straw man as well, because I don't think it's as much of a straw man. I think the man is still alive. And then, Bernadette, we will go to you for your question. So I'll first give it to Hanne on Daniel's word of caution.
Yeah, thank you very much for all the reflections. That was really great, Kristien and Daniel. I'm curious also to hear what other people have to say. So very briefly, letting be is not letting go. It's not recognizing, oh, there are Tourettic people and these are their problems, and let them tell what they have to tell. It's really also letting be is a form of containing in a way. So to see all that's going on, to listen to people, and I really love that you mentioned this thing about your approach with the zines, that it's what I would really like to understand better what works about it, and that it's the messiness and the distribution and the powerfulness and the political of it, I think is fascinating. And there's something about the relation between the messiness and why it's powerful, why it works, and why it's life-changing. And that's also related to letting be and containing the difficulties and the mess, and letting this mess be. And having letting be is also about realizing how everybody changes by letting be. So also the people who are the onlookers, as Diana said towards the end of the talk, the onlookers change and have to change too. And that comes directly from allowing the mess, or understanding the mess, listening to the messiness. And as Kristien said, the behavioral, the political, go back into the biological and make changes there too. And that's also part of all of that. And so definitely services need to be better. That point is totally important. And I won't speak more about that because that's not my expertise, but I think that's really important in what you said, Daniel, that it's not a letting go.
Yeah, and I think
on the contrary. Yeah. But I can understand that it could be misunderstood that way, but
yeah, I think that Daniel, what you refer to is a letting go, which is a little bit endemic to the political circumstances, which are basically, and that is something which could happen, and which we obviously don't want to happen, but it is like saying, well, given that they can find their own way, we can let go of them. And we don't have to budget services and so on and so forth. And obviously, if you don't hear the voices, if you don't listen to the voices, you don't hear them, you cannot do something with them. Before I go to the other questions, I don't know, Diana, you have to raise your hand if you want to respond to something of Daniel, or just unmute. But I just want to very quickly pick up on what I already said to Kristien. I don't have to belabor it. Probably, I think, Kristien, I don't know, but do you agree that as a neuroscientist, let me say it like that, that the way that you look at neuroscience is not necessarily the standard way that a peer reviewer in, for instance, brain would look at it?
I think that's fair. Yes, yeah. I think that you are right to say that there are much more reductionistic views of this. At sort of the only thing that sort of is central to those empirical questions is what is the brain doing? But I will say the piece I think that it is more generalizable beyond me. Is I do see there is much more attention being paid to this issue of individual functioning as well as environment brain interactions. I do see that happening.
Yeah, no, and I think you're certainly also on the interpretation of inhibition, and maybe we will talk later. But it is an interesting. It's one of those interesting word things where philosophers, neuroscientists, sometimes they can get away with whatever they say, but that's something that I think we can come back to